April 30th, 1944. Boeing Plant 2, Seattle, Washington. The late shift ended at midnight, but the floodlights never dimmed. In the cavernous assembly hall, the smell of riveted aluminum hung thick in the air, mixing with hydraulic fluid and the acrid burn of welding torches. The concrete floor trembled beneath the weight of machinery that never slept. Outside, the drizzle painted halos around street lamps, and the dark waters of the Duwamish River reflected the glow of a factory that ran on borrowed time and borrowed sleep. Inside, workers moved with mechanical precision between skeletal airframes stretching 30 stories across the production floor. Wing sections descended from overhead cranes. Fuselages rolled forward on assembly tracks. The cacophony of pneumatic hammers merged into a single industrial heartbeat. And in those 24 hours, in the space between one midnight and the next, 16 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses rolled out the massive bay doors, engines gleaming, ready for war. 16 heavy bombers. In a single day. From a single factory. In a city most Europeans had never heard of. The numbers defied comprehension, and yet they were real, documented, photographed, and witnessed by thousands. Boeing Plant 2 was not merely assembling aircraft, it was manufacturing hope at a pace that seemed to violate the laws of industrial physics. But to understand what Seattle achieved, one must first understand what the enemy believed was possible. In the spring of 1940, as German panzers rolled through France and Luftwaffe bombers darkened the skies over Rotterdam, the industrial capacity of the Third Reich represented the pinnacle of European manufacturing might. Germany's aircraft production had been carefully planned, methodically organized, and ruthlessly prioritized since 1933 under the Reich Air Ministry led by Hermann Göring. The aviation industry sprawled across the Reich's conquered territories, from Messerschmitt plants in Augsburg to Junkers facilities in Dessau, from Focke-Wulf factories in Bremen to Heinkel works in Rostock. By 1939, Germany produced 8,295 military aircraft. The numbers climbed steadily. 10,826 in 1940, then 11,776 in 1941. These were respectable figures, the product of Europe's most advanced industrial economy harnessed for total war. Britain, despite being bombed relentlessly, managed comparable production. 7,940 aircraft in 1939, then 15,049 in 1940, reaching 20,094 by 1941. Together, the two most industrialized nations in Europe were producing roughly 30,000 to 35,000 aircraft annually by 1941. The entire European continent at peak wartime mobilization could not exceed this rate by much. Then came Pearl Harbor, and everything the Germans thought they knew about industrial warfare became obsolete. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would build 50,000 aircraft per year, Göring reportedly laughed. 50,000 planes. It was propaganda, surely. Wishful thinking from a nation of automobile manufacturers who knew nothing of building combat aircraft at scale. German military intelligence, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, analyzed American industrial capabilities and concluded the target was impossible. America had produced merely 2,141 military aircraft in all of 1939. To increase production 25-fold within 2 years violated every principle of industrial planning the Germans understood. The steel requirements alone would overwhelm American mills. The labor force didn't exist. The engineering expertise was scattered across civilian industries. And most damning of all, American aircraft companies were small, specialized firms, not vertically integrated industrial combines like Messerschmitt or Junkers. The assessment was clear: American production targets were fantasy. The real threat came from Britain and the Soviet Union. America was an economic giant, yes, but war production required more than raw materials and capital. It required a manufacturing culture that Germany had spent 2 decades perfecting. The Abwehr was catastrophically wrong. What German officers expected was an America that followed European industrial logic. They expected factories that tooled up slowly, that prioritized quality over quantity, that required years to reach full production capacity. They expected American individualism to clash with the collective discipline required for mass wartime production. They expected labor shortages to cripple expansion. They expected material shortages to strangle supply chains. They expected the vast American geography to create logistical nightmares. They expected, in short, that America would behave like a European power. What German officers experienced when they saw it with their own eyes was something else entirely. Something that shattered every assumption they held about what was industrially possible. By 1942, American aircraft production hit 47,836 units. Not 50,000, but close enough to prove Roosevelt's promise was no bluff. In 1943, production soared to 85,898 aircraft. And in 1944, the year that would mark the true apex of American industrial might, 96,318 military aircraft rolled off American assembly lines. That single year of American production exceeded Germany's entire six-year wartime output, exceeded Britain's entire six-year wartime output, exceeded Japan's entire wartime production. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured more military aircraft than Germany, Britain, and Japan produced combined during their peak year. The numbers were so staggering that Allied intelligence officers initially disbelieved their own production reports and cross-checked them multiple times. But the truly devastating realization, the one that broke the morale of German technical experts when they encountered it, was that this miracle was not concentrated in Detroit's auto plants or California's aircraft factories. A substantial portion of this production came from a single plant, in a rainy city in the Pacific Northwest, where nobody in Berlin had ever expected to find an industrial colossus. Boeing Plant 2 in Seattle became the crucible where American productive capacity transformed from theory into crushing reality. Built rapidly between 1936 and 1941, the facility stretched across Boeing Field like an aluminum cathedral. Inside, the assembly process had been redesigned from first principles. Traditional aircraft manufacturing built planes sequentially, one at a time, with skilled craftsmen moving from station to station. Boeing Plant 2 implemented Henry Ford's assembly line philosophy with aeronautical engineering precision. Airframes moved continuously through production stations. Components arrived in synchronized timing from specialized work centers. Subassemblies, wings, tail sections, bomb bay doors, turrets, were manufactured in parallel and integrated at precise intervals. The factory operated 24 hours a day, in 3 shifts. Workers came from everywhere: farmhands from eastern Washington, loggers from the Olympic Peninsula, shipyard workers from Puget Sound, women who had never held a rivet gun before December 7, 1941. They were trained in weeks, not years. They learned from manuals illustrated with clear diagrams, not apprenticeships spanning a decade. They used power tools and jigs that made precision manufacturing accessible to semi-skilled labor. And they produced aircraft at a rate that would have seemed like science fiction in 1939. On March 31, 1944, the 362nd B-17 Flying Fortress built that month rolled out the door at Boeing Plant 2. 362 bombers in 31 days. That single month's production from one Seattle factory exceeded the total bomber production of many entire nations during the war. The daily average that spring was 12 B-17s per day. On the record day, April 30, 1944, 16 bombers were completed in 24 hours. Not partially assembled, not lacking engines or instruments. Fully operational, combat-ready B-17G Flying Fortresses, each weighing 65,000 pounds fully loaded, each bristling with 13.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs across 2,000 miles to targets deep in the Third Reich. Boeing Plant 2 alone built 6,980 1B-17s between 1934 and the last aircraft rolling off the line on April 9, 1945. But even this was only part of the American production miracle. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach and Lockheed Vega in Burbank added another 5,745 B-17s through a collaborative production program that shared blueprints, tooling specifications, and manufacturing innovations across companies. The total: 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 12,000 bombers of a single type. Germany produced approximately 18,000 medium and heavy bombers of all types during the entire war. Britain produced roughly 18,000 heavy bombers of all types during the entire war. The B-17 alone, one American aircraft design, matched the combined bomber production of Europe's 2 largest industrial powers. And the B-17 was not even America's most produced bomber. The consolidated B-24 Liberator exceeded 18,500 units, making it the most produced heavy bomber, multi-engine aircraft, and American military aircraft in history. No aircraft in any nation has ever matched that production total. The moment of realization, when German officers confronted the true scale of American production, came not on battlefields, but in prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American heartland. More than 371,000 German soldiers were captured during the war and transported to over 700 POW camps across the United States. They expected prison. They found an industrial demonstration. German POWs arrived in America by ship, disembarking at East Coast ports, and were transported by rail to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Wisconsin, Michigan. The train journey itself became an education in American scale. For days, they traveled through landscapes that never ended. Farmlands stretching to the horizon. Cities that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. Industrial complexes visible from the rail lines, factories belching smoke day and night, freight yards stacked with military equipment awaiting shipment. One captured Luftwaffe officer recorded in his diary the moment his train passed through the outskirts of Detroit at night. The glow of factory furnaces turned the sky orange for miles. He estimated he could see at least 30 major industrial facilities from the train window alone. In Germany, such a concentration of production capacity would be spread across an entire industrial region. Here, it was merely one city's automotive district operating at wartime tempo. The camps themselves were adequately supplied by international standards. The Geneva Convention required it, and America complied. But it was not the conditions of imprisonment that shattered German prisoners' morale. It was the casual abundance. The food portions were larger than what German civilians received under rationing. The barracks had heating and plumbing that worked reliably. The camp supply warehouses stocked replacement uniforms, boots, toiletries, cigarettes. One captured panzer commander noted bitterly that American POWs in Germany fought over scraps, while German POWs in America complained about the coffee being too weak. But these were minor irritations compared to what came next. American authorities, with calculated psychological precision, organized work details that placed German prisoners inside American factories. The stated purpose was labor. POWs worked in agriculture, forestry, and light manufacturing under Geneva Convention rules. The unstated purpose was demonstration. German engineers and technicians found themselves assigned to factories producing war material at rates they had been told were impossible. They stood on factory floors where assembly lines stretched further than they could see. They watched railroad cars arrive every hour with raw materials and depart with finished goods. They saw workers, many of them women, many of them barely trained, operating machinery with casual competence. They witnessed inventory systems that ensured parts arrived exactly when needed, not a day early or late. They observed maintenance crews that kept production lines running continuously through preventive scheduling rather than reactive repairs. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, German POWs watched B-24 Liberators roll off the assembly line at a rate of 1 per hour during peak production. 1 per hour. A 4-engine strategic bomber. Willow Run's assembly line stretched over a mile. The facility employed 42,000 workers and operated continuously. German prisoners assigned to work details there, sorting parts, moving materials, cleaning work areas, walked the length of the production floor, and saw aircraft in every stage of assembly simultaneously. Fuselages being riveted, wings being attached, engines being installed, instruments being calibrated, paint being applied, final inspections being conducted, and at the end of the line, finished bombers taxiing under their own power to the adjacent airfield for test flights. Hour after hour. Day after day, former Luftwaffe pilots found the experience particularly demoralizing. They had flown missions where encountering a dozen American bombers constituted a major raid. Now, they stood inside a single factory that produced more bombers in a week than the Luftwaffe could shoot down in a month. The mathematics became inescapable. Even if German pilots achieved favorable kill ratios, and they often did, America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Attrition warfare against an opponent who manufactured aircraft faster than you could destroy them was not war. It was slow-motion industrial suicide. Some German officers were taken on carefully orchestrated tours of American industrial facilities. The tours were not accidental. American intelligence understood the psychological value of demoralization. A captured Wehrmacht captain who toured a steel mill in Pittsburgh wrote in a letter intercepted by sensors, "They showed us one plant. One. It produced more steel in a month than all of Essen. And the guide told us, smiling, that this was a medium-sized facility." I did not believe him. Then I saw the production schedules posted on the wall. He was not exaggerating. If anything, he was being modest. This is not a war we can win. This is a war we have already lost. We simply have not admitted it yet. The Boeing plants in Seattle received visits from captured Luftwaffe officers as part of intelligence-gathering operations. American authorities wanted German assessments of American production methods for post-war analysis. What they got instead was documentation of psychological collapse. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, became Hitler's last hope for matching Allied production. Speer's organizational genius did produce remarkable results. German aircraft production climbed from 15,596 in 1942 to 25,527 in 1943, then peaked at 39,807 in 1944. Speer called it the armaments miracle, and by European standards it was. German production nearly tripled in 3 years despite sustained Allied bombing. But Speer himself recognized the futility. In interrogations after the war, he admitted that seeing American production statistics in intelligence reports convinced him Germany would lose by mid-1944. The numbers were too overwhelming. America produced 96,318 aircraft in 1944. Germany produced 39,807. The ratio was more than 2-to-1, and that was during Germany's best year ever. America's production was merely routine industrial output sustained month after month. Speer calculated that even if Germany somehow doubled production again, an impossibility, America could still outproduce the Reich simply by maintaining existing capacity. The war had become a production problem, and Germany had no solution. The symbolic object that came to represent American industrial supremacy was not a weapon or a flag. It was a simple aluminum rivet, millions upon millions of them. Small, mass-produced, individually insignificant, collectively transformative. Each B-17 Flying Fortress required approximately 400,000 rivets to hold its airframe together. Boeing Plant 2, at peak production, installed over 160 million rivets per month. The rivets arrived by railroad car from manufacturing plants across America, plants that produced nothing but rivets, billions of them annually, in standardized sizes that fit standardized holes drilled by standardized jigs operated by workers trained in days rather than years. German aircraft, by contrast, used rivets produced in smaller quantities by multiple suppliers to varying specifications, requiring skilled workers to adapt installation techniques to each batch. The difference seemed trivial. It was not. Those rivets, uniform, abundant, cheaply produced, instantly interchangeable, embodied the philosophy that allowed America to outproduce Europe combined. German engineers understood this eventually. One captured Messerschmitt designer, examining a damaged B-17 in a Luftwaffe technical intelligence unit, noted the rivet pattern with professional admiration. The American approach used more rivets than strictly necessary from an engineering standpoint. But the excess provided structural redundancy, simplified repairs, and eliminated the need for precision placement. A German aircraft used fewer rivets, precisely placed, requiring skilled labor. An American aircraft used more rivets, adequately placed, requiring semi-skilled labor. The German approach produced a technically superior individual aircraft. The American approach produced vastly more aircraft that were good enough to win. In war, good enough in quantity defeats perfect in scarcity. The rivets piled up in bins beside assembly stations. They rattled through pneumatic guns operated by workers who installed thousands per shift. They held together wings that lifted bombers over the Atlantic. They secured fuselages that absorbed flak damage and brought crews home. They were the mundane hardware of an industrial miracle, overlooked and essential, the tiny metal fasteners that held together the arsenal of democracy. The transformation in German military perception occurred gradually, then suddenly. In 1940, German officers believed the Luftwaffe was invincible. In 1941, they believed Germany could outproduce any single enemy. In 1942, they believed combined Allied production could be offset by superior German engineering and tactics. In 1943, they began to doubt. In 1944, they knew. By 1945, even die-hard Nazi fanatics privately admitted that industrial capacity, not ideology or courage or tactical brilliance, determined modern war's outcome. The evidence accumulated relentlessly. German pilots reported bomber formations that darkened the sky, formations so large they took minutes to pass overhead. Intelligence officers counted serial numbers on crashed American aircraft and realized the numbering systems indicated production rates far higher than Germany had estimated. Luftwaffe ground crews examined captured B-17s and found assembly line construction techniques that sacrificed individual craftsmanship for mass production efficiency. German civilians, when Allied bombers arrived in thousand-plane raids, understood viscerally that quantity had become its own quality. You could shoot down 10 bombers and still have 900 drop their payloads. You could destroy 20 bombers and still have 1,000 tons of ordnance obliterate your city. The mathematics overwhelmed courage. Hermann Göring, who had mocked American production targets in 1940, admitted in 1945 during interrogation that underestimating American industrial capacity was one of the Luftwaffe's greatest strategic failures. He confessed that America would behave like a European power, that mobilization would take years, that production would be constrained by labor shortages and material bottlenecks, that achieving maximum output would require the same totalitarian control mechanisms Germany employed. He had not anticipated that American decentralization, the free market competition, the dispersed industrial base, the collaborative information sharing between private companies would prove more efficient than German centralized planning. He had not understood that democracy, which he considered weak and indecisive, could mobilize faster and more completely than fascism when survival demanded it. His laughter in 1940 became bitter regret in 1945. For ordinary German soldiers, the transformation was more personal and immediate. Captured POWs who worked in American factories and then returned to Germany after the war carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. They told their families about assembly lines that never stopped. They described warehouses stocked with spare parts as far as the eye could see. They recounted casual conversations with American workers who complained about overtime while producing in weeks what German workers produced in months. The story spread through word of mouth, creating a legend of American abundance that persisted long after the war ended. In the rubble of post-war Germany, when former soldiers gathered in bars and shared memories, the tales of American production capacity became cautionary folklore, stories told to explain how the Third Reich, which had seemed invincible in 1940, lay in ruins 5 years later. The explanation was always the same: they outproduced us. We cannot match their factories. We fought with courage and skill, but they fought with abundance. And abundance won. The transformation was not just military, but philosophical. German officers, trained in a military tradition that valorized individual heroism and tactical brilliance, confronted an industrial warfare paradigm where strategy required accountants as much as generals. Victory belonged not to the most courageous soldiers or the most brilliant commanders, but to the nation that mobilized resources most completely. In that contest, Germany never stood a chance against America. Seattle's Boeing Plant 2 alone outproduced entire European industrial regions. And Seattle was merely one city among dozens of American production centers operating at similar intensity. The epilogue to Seattle's bomber production unfolded not in the skies over Europe, but in the quiet realization that transformed post-war geopolitics. When the last B-17 rolled off the assembly line at Boeing Plant 2 on April 9, 1945, aircraft serial number 43 to 39,508, built almost exactly 5 years after Roosevelt's 50,000 plane promise, the war in Europe had weeks remaining. Germany would surrender on May 8. Japan would surrender in August. The bomber Seattle produced had carried the war to the enemy's heartland with relentless, mathematically inevitable pressure. But the true legacy was not the destruction inflicted. It was the demonstration of what organized, democratic industrial society could achieve when fully mobilized. Soviet observers, present at American factories during the war as part of Lend-Lease coordination, returned to Moscow with reports that shaped Stalin's post-war strategy. The Americans, they noted, had not merely outproduced Germany. They had outproduced the entire world combined while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, supplying allies across the globe, and maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded wartime conditions in other nations. This was not temporary mobilization. This was sustainable industrial capacity that could be maintained indefinitely. The implications terrified Soviet planners. The Cold War's arms race began with this realization. America possessed production capacity that could not be matched through centralized planning alone. For Germany, the lesson learned at catastrophic cost became foundational to post-war reconstruction. West German industry, rebuilt with Marshall Plan assistance, abandoned the autarkic, vertically integrated model favored by Nazi planners. Instead, German manufacturers adopted American-style supply chain management, standardized components, and collaborative information sharing between firms. The German industrial resurgence of the 1950s and 1960s succeeded precisely because it incorporated the production philosophy that had defeated the Third Reich, the philosophy Seattle embodied. For America, Seattle's achievement became both validation and warning. Validation that democratic institutions could mobilize more completely than totalitarian systems. Warning that industrial capacity, once demonstrated, created expectations and responsibilities. The bombers that flew from Seattle to Berlin established America's role as guarantor of the post-war order. The same production capacity that built B-17s could build passenger jets, space rockets, and the material abundance that defined American life for generations. The Seattle bomber factories closed after the war. Plant 2 transitioned to commercial aircraft production, where Boeing became synonymous with passenger aviation. The workers dispersed, returning to peacetime lives, carrying with them the memory of what they had accomplished. But the facility itself, the physical space where 16 bombers emerged in a single day, became a monument to industrial possibility. Historians would later debate whether the war was won on the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Britain, on the steppes of Russia. The truth, prosaic and undeniable, was that it was won in places like Seattle, where ordinary people working ordinary hours with extraordinary coordination built the tools of victory faster than the enemy could destroy them. The German officers who witnessed this firsthand, who stood in American factories and understood the industrial gulf they faced, returned to post-war Germany carrying a bitter knowledge. They had not lost because they lacked courage. They had not lost because their weapons were inferior. They had not lost because their soldiers were less skilled. They lost because modern war was an industrial problem, and America solved it with ruthless efficiency. Seattle produced more bombers than all of Europe combined, not through superior ideology or national destiny, but through superior organization, collaborative effort, and the freedom to innovate that democratic systems, for all their inefficiencies, enabled better than totalitarian control. The rivets that held those bombers together, for 100,000 per aircraft, 160 million per month, billions during the war, were tiny monuments to an idea larger than military victory. They represented the paradox of democratic power, that decentralized, individualistic societies could, when necessity demanded, coordinate their efforts more completely than authoritarian regimes that controlled every aspect of production. That ordinary citizens, voluntarily organized and adequately supplied, could outproduce conscripted labor working under compulsion. That abundance, not scarcity, was the natural state of free people working toward common purpose. In the decades after the war, when Boeing's 747s flew passengers across oceans, when American prosperity seemed inevitable, when the industrial landscape shifted from manufacturing to services, it became easy to forget what Seattle accomplished between 1941 and 1945. The numbers 6,981 bombers from one plant, 12,731 B-17s total, 96,318 American aircraft in 1944 alone, became statistics in history books, abstract and distant. But to the German officers who witnessed American production firsthand, who stood on factory floors and understood the implications, those numbers were never abstract. They were evidence of a fundamental truth about power and industrial civilization, that wars are won not by the bravest soldiers or the best generals, but by the society that mobilizes its productive capacity most completely. And in that contest, Seattle's contribution was not merely significant. It was decisive. The last B-17 built in Seattle, number 43 to 39,508, never saw combat. The war ended too quickly. It flew training missions for several years, then was scrapped like thousands of others, melted down, and recycled into the peacetime economy. No monument marks its passing, but its significance endures in the historical record, in the memories of those who built it, and in the lesson it teaches about what organized democratic society can achieve when freedom and necessity align. Seattle produced more bombers than all of Europe, combined not because Americans were better people, but because American institutions enabled better coordination of effort. That lesson, learned at terrible cost by German officers who underestimated it, remains relevant wherever freedom confronts tyranny, and must prove its practical worth. The rivets that held those bombers together have long since rusted away. The factory floors where they were installed have been demolished or repurposed. The workers who drove them home have passed into memory. But the idea those rivets represented, that small, standardized, abundant components, properly organized, can build something greater than individual genius ever could, that idea endures. It built the bombers that won the war. It built the peace that followed. And it remains, fundamentally, the unglamorous answer to how democracy defeats dictatorship, not through superior ideology or nobler purpose, but through better organization of productive capacity. One rivet at a time, one bomber at a time, until the accumulated weight of industrial abundance becomes irresistible, inevitable, and decisive. That was Seattle's gift to history. That was the lesson German officers learned too late. And that remains the truth that 16 bombers in a single day, extraordinary yet routine, miraculous yet mundane, represents for any age that confronts the question of what free people, properly mobilized, can accomplish.